Throughout the atomic age, the prestigious Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists, published in Chicago, has maintained a symbolic clock showing how close they think the world is to nuclear war. They call it the Doomsday Clock, and every so often the magazine's editorial panel decides to move the clock closer to or further back from midnight, or doomsday. In its latest edition, the Bulletin says it is moving the clock forward to 3 minutes to 12 because its scientists see a situation of extreme and immediate danger. The clock's movement will be marked at news conferences tomorrow in Chicago, London, Washington, Stockholm, and Tokyo. Tonight, we examine whether its symbolic message is accurate on the dangers of nuclear war. We begin with a history of the Doomsday Clock, assembled with the help of the PBS series Nova and a recent program called Nuclear Strategy for Beginners. The clock made its first appearance in 1947 as the U.S. made post-war advances in its development of atomic weapons. The Bulletin then determined that mankind was 7 minutes from doomsday. When the Soviet Union exploded its first atomic bomb in 1949, developing it much faster than the U.S. had expected, the atomic scientists advanced their clock to 3 minutes to doomsday, sensing that a nuclear arms race had begun. As indeed it had. In 1952, the United States successfully tested the still more powerful hydrogen bomb, 1,000 times greater than the force of the Hiroshima atomic bomb. When the Soviet Union acquired the H-bomb, the doomsday clock was moved to 2 minutes to midnight, the closest it would ever come in the 36 years between 1947 and now. After the Cuban Missile Crisis, the atomic scientists breathed easier. The signing of the Partial Test Ban Treaty, stopping above-ground nuclear testing, seemed to signal a break in world tension. In 1963, it was 12 minutes to doomsday. In 1968, the nuclear club was joined by mainland China. The clock moved up 5 minutes, 7 minutes to midnight. A year later, the minute hand moved back 3 minutes, 10 to midnight, as the United States ratified the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. Still another step backward from the nuclear abyss. 1972, Nixon and Brezhnev initiated the Strategic Arms Limitation Talks. It led to the first arms control agreement between the United States and the Soviet Union. The scientists moved the clock back to 12 minutes, the farthest from doomsday they felt mankind had ever been in the atomic age. 1974, a 3-minute advance, 9 minutes to midnight. The SALT process bogged down. Both sides continued to build up. India joined the nuclear club.
The system is survivable, it's verifiable, it has a minimum impact on the environment.
President Carter introduced the MX missile, a more accurate, reliable system, less vulnerable to Soviet first strike. The atomic scientists advanced their clock 2 minutes. In 1980, it was 7 minutes to midnight.
Our deployed nuclear forces were built before the age of microcircuits.
The Reagan administration vowed to restore U.S. nuclear strength. There were reports of acquiring superiority over the Soviets, of prevailing in nuclear conflict. New weapons were deployed or restored to the defense budget. The MX missile, the Trident submarine-launched missile, the B-1 bomber. The doomsday clock was advanced 3 minutes. In 1981, it was 4 minutes to midnight. Tomorrow, citing the breakdown in arms reduction talks with the Soviets, a continuing arms race, the Korean jetliner disaster, and America's use of force in the Caribbean, the atomic scientists will push their clock another minute closer to doomsday. It will be 3 minutes to midnight, the closest in 30 years.
One of the scientists who was involved in the decision to move the atomic clock forward is here to tell us why. He is Richard Garwin, a professor of physics at Columbia University. Dr. Garwin has been a consultant to the Defense Department and the White House in both Democratic and Republican administrations going back to 1950. Dr. Garwin, why has the clock been moved closer to midnight?
Well, let's start first with the least dangerous aspect, and that's the much-touted confrontation between the Soviet SS-20 missiles, which they recently deployed to replace their old SS-4s and SS-5s, and the 572 U.S. nuclear missiles, which we are now deploying in our allied countries in Europe. And the Soviets say that will force them to deploy similar mobile missiles in Bulgaria and other Warsaw Pact countries and on submarines around the U.S. But that's totally optional. Either one could have stopped at any time, can stop now. More threatening is the deployment of counterforce nuclear weapons, accurate ICBMs on the Soviet side, which threaten U.S. silos, and similar weapons on our side. Now, even if one had enough counterforce weapons to make a first strike disarming capability, it would not disarm the other side. It would just drive them to a launch under attack policy, launch on warning. But that wouldn't make us happy to have forced the Soviet Union to a position of launching their weapons on the reports of their radars and their computers. So that's more dangerous. But most dangerous is the initiative that President Reagan announced on March 23rd to try to obtain a total defense against Soviet ballistic missiles and nuclear weapons of all forms. That would really disarm the Soviet Union. It would reduce their confidence that they could retaliate against the United States if we attacked them, and it could drive them to strike first before such a system could be deployed.
But you're talking a lot of coulds here. I mean, what evidence is there that this really, in reality, will move us closer to nuclear disaster?
Well, the clock is really an international symbol of danger, like the exclamation point you see on a traffic sign. But lifting the clock on the cover of the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists, you can find inside an international forum of ideas and the reasons for the unanimous recommendation for advancing the clock. We have a lot of historical experience, not with strategic nuclear war, thank God. The historical experience, for instance, is that when there was a whiff of Soviet ballistic missile defense deployment in the 1960s, the United States expanded its strategic offensive force, introduced MIRVs, the multiple independently targeted reentry vehicles. We have the history of World War I, in which there were armed camps on both sides and no particular reason to go to war, unlike World War II, but it happened through a minor provocation.
So in other words, you're using history as your guide as well as the things that you just mentioned that mix into this equation.
Yes, we don't have any scientific models of human behavior, but we have a lot of fears. There is the capability to destroy. One could destroy the Soviet society with 100 nuclear weapons. We have 10,000 strategic nuclear weapons.
All right, thank you. Robin?
Our next guest believed that moving the clock closer to doomsday does not really represent the situation between the superpowers as it is. He is Stephen Meyer, professor of political science at MIT, the author of many books and articles on the Soviet military. He joins us from public station WGBH in Boston. Professor Meyer, you don't think it's right to move the clock closer to doomsday because the scientists believe we are getting closer to nuclear war?
No, I think the clock is a symbol of events, good and bad, taking place, but those events really say nothing about the relative change and likelihood of a nuclear war or a crisis or a confrontation between the United States and the Soviet Union escalating into any kind of a nuclear war at all. So the clock, and if one looks at the history of that clock and the kinds of events it's been sensitive to, it has been a good chronicler of good and bad events in the security field, but there is no way one could gauge from that whether or not decision makers in the United States or the Soviet Union would be more likely or less likely to use nuclear weapons in a given situation, nor is it a good representation of the issue of whether or not those two countries are more or less likely to get into a direct confrontation. Indeed, if you look back over the history of the clock, you'll find that many of the confrontations, either over Berlin or over Cuba, or having to do with China that the United States and the Soviet Union got into were in periods of time after the clock had been moved in the opposite direction.
Well, what is the, if you see one, what is the fallacy in the scientist reasoning here?
I'm not sure I'd use the word fallacy, but I think that their approach to analyzing the relationship between events and the likelihood of nuclear war looks too much at rational decision-making, at pre-calculated notions of how decision makers think. And indeed, when you look at domestic politics in both the United States and the Soviet Union, and you look at allied relationships with the countries in Europe, both between Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union and Western Europe and the United States, you find there's a much more complex web of factors that influence how decision makers think about confrontations and crises, and how they think about the different forces they have available and how they might employ them in a confrontation or crisis.
Do you yourself believe that we have moved closer to nuclear war as a result of the incidents that the scientists list?
No, I don't believe so. I think, in fact, if you look back since the Cuban Missile Crisis, you'll find that, whatever the value of the probability of a nuclear war occurring, it's been fairly constant, with a few notable exceptions that revolve around crises. You cannot look at the general tenor of the times in terms of individual events and make an assessment about the likelihood of nuclear war. In fact, the real question you should be asking is, what's the likelihood that your bank is going to recall your 30-year mortgage early because there's a fear that somehow you won't be around to repay it 25 years from now? And my sense is that people are still putting money into individual retirement accounts, and wisely, and they're still saving money for their kids to go to college, and that if you look back at what's happened over the last 20 years, the chance that either side would use nuclear weapons to carry out foreign policy in a rational way has decreased. If you look at the likelihood of an accidental nuclear war occurring, that's actually gone down because the technologies have improved, the control technologies have improved. And if you look at the question about even the rhetoric over the last several years, the Reagan administration and the Andropov and Brezhnev administrations have toned down quite a lot the rhetoric about the winnability of nuclear war and the likelihood of using nuclear war to prosecute foreign policy goals.
Well, thank you. Charlene?
Dr. Garwin, in a couple of words, Mr. Meyer just said that your analysis is too simplistic.
Well, we don't really have an analysis. We have a warning and an understanding, and I respect Professor Meyer. He's a fine person. I'll tell you what we could have done, though, and I think he would...
Let me just ask you, though, on the specific of what he says. He says that you're looking too much at pre-calculated notions of how the various players are going to perform. You don't buy that argument?
What I'm saying is that one can arrange the possession of nuclear weapons and the systems of nuclear weapons such that the system is entirely unstable, as was the case before World War I.
And that's what you feel is the situation now?
For instance, if I hold my pen like that, it's stable, it wiggles. But if I stand it on end like that, it falls over. And it doesn't take much in moving the center of gravity of the system to convert a system from a stable confrontation into an unstable confrontation.
Mr. Meyer, what do you say to that?
Well, I don't have the benefit of Dick's pen, but I guess my view is that we really, in looking back of the confrontations between the United States and the Soviet Union over the past 30 years, as a matter of fact, what's interesting is the lack of learning behavior that's gone on between the two countries. And to argue that one set of developments, an MX missile on the one hand versus an SS-18 ICBM on the other, is more likely or less likely to push a country into a certain pattern of decision-making, does not consider all the many factors that come into play. Indeed, if you look back over decision-making in the Eisenhower administration about whether or not to use nuclear weapons and compare that to the Kennedy administration and then the Nixon administration and now the Reagan administration, you'll find that at each stage, the decision has become more stable. The likelihood of them deciding for use of nuclear weapons has gone down tremendously, precisely because the system has been getting more stable and not less so. So the pen analogy works. I just think it's going in the opposite direction.
Dr. Garwin?
Well, people will use nuclear weapons only as an act of desperation. And if we force the Soviet Union into the corner, threatening to disarm them by deploying perfect defenses or through the ability to destroy their weapons preemptively, then they will put them on a hair trigger and they may launch.
But Mr. Meyer says that the rhetoric and everything else is decreasing rather than increasing, that the environment for this kind of confrontation is not as threatening as you suggest.
Well, we could go back and find some facts, like the president's characterization of the Soviet Union as the focus of evil in the world. And there are real problems in this. Furthermore, if you were threatening to destroy or aiming to destroy another country, the Soviets aiming to destroy us, they wouldn't necessarily trumpet it. So we have to look at facts and capabilities and certainly not at announcements. We have also a political process which does not, in fact, confer popularity on people who are too aggressive about their intentions in using nuclear weapons.
So you're saying that the rhetoric as well as the deployment is enough for you to be very nervous?
I am concerned, yes. I think we should have canceled our MX missile last year. I think the Soviet Union, for instance, should have said in deploying its SS-20s that they would deploy fewer warheads than they were replacing. Either of those would have been a good sign.
But otherwise, and that would have turned back the clock, so to speak.
Moved us in the opposite direction.
You don't buy that, Mr. Meyer?
Well, I'm not sure it's a question of buying it, but the fault in Dick's analysis, and it is an analysis, is that on the one hand he says, let's look at the rhetoric, and then he said, but let's discount statements and look at the evidence. So, you know, look at the evidence, and what you find, first of all, is that for the last 30 years, the Soviet Union and the leadership of the Soviet Union have been saying explicitly that the capitalist countries of the West, and in particular the United States, as the leading country of the capitalist West, is the embodiment of evil in their own terminology, that it's the cause of the arms race, which is simply defined as any time the West builds something, that's the arms race, and that it's the cause of all turmoil, economic and political repression in the world. So that's been their line for 30 years. Now, that's not to say that the time is for the U.S. government to get into the same kind of name-calling, but if the rhetoric is a problem, that's been going on from the beginning.
All right, well, I'm sorry, Mr. Meyer, but we have to end it there. Thank you, Dr. Garwin and Mr. Meyer. Robin?
A new medical study says people in the early stages of diabetes may be protected from blindness and kidney failure by a